artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hi, this is episode 312, and I have been talking with Tomaso Poggio, Eugene McDermott Professor in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences at MIT, and the Director of the Center for Brains, Minds, and Machines, and one of the founders of the field of computational neuroscience. Tomaso is a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and a founding Fellow of the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence. He develops models of brain function that illuminate human intelligence and builds intelligent machines that can mimic human performance. And that encompasses a whole lot more achievements than I have room to recite here. Last week, he defined computational neuroscience, and we talked about computation in the human brain, how large language models landed for him, holography, limitations of LLMs, and backpropagation equivalents in the human brain. This week, we're going to talk about learning in the brain and synaptic mechanisms, the role of sleep, what AI scientists should pay more attention to from neuroscience, other computational mechanisms in the brain besides neurons, connectomics, robots, and flies and worms. Like last week, there are a couple of terms I want to define going in. We will mention these. Glial cells are cells in the brain that aren't neurons. They don't get a lot of love because we don't see them doing the same signaling trick that neurons do, but we're finding out that they're pretty important. And connectomics is the study of the connections between neurons. And a map of all those connections is called a connectome, drawing a parallel with a genome. There's an ambitious project called the Human Connectome Project to do that for the human brain, all 100 trillion connections. Okay, enough explanation. Back to the interview with Tomaso Poggio. So to get very technical for a moment, then backpropagation is about setting the activation function weights on synapses in an artificial network. And in a biological brain, then those are activation potentials. Correct me if I'm wrong, which I will be at some point. Has any research or study ever observed an activation potential changing on a biological neuron or a synapse, and put forward some theory as to what made that happen?
Well, there is a recent paper just a few weeks old in Nature by a collaborator of mine who shows it's experiment in the mouse that error signals in cortex of the mouse can change the behavior of the mouse. So there is learning, and it's learning at the level of separate synapses on different neurons. So yes, there is evidence for it. It's not clear how this happens at this point. What is the mechanism doing this? But I think explaining this, how this happens, is potentially exactly what I was discussing before, if we could understand what synaptic mechanism can do that.
What's the next big frontier in computational neuroscience? What is the next thing that you would like to see opened up that you think we might be close enough to seeing some kind of big revelation?
Well, as I said, I think this one of which supervised learning mechanisms are used in the brain, so the equivalent of backpropagation, to my mind is a key step for computational neuroscience. It's not the only one, of course, but would suddenly make a connection between, really a fundamental connection at the mechanistic level between what happens in the brain in terms of learning and what happens in our neural networks. So a lot of other things would then become possible or fall into place. There are similar related problems in computational neuroscience. For instance, is there a connection between what transformers do and what happens in the brain? We don't know right now. It looks unlikely, but there are some potential similarities at the level of recordings with functional MRI in the brain and how transformer is like a correlation that suggests maybe there is some machinery somewhat at some level similar to transformers that works in the brain. Again, I think the details are likely to be different. It's very unlikely there are tokens in the brain, but open question.
What do you think is going on in the human brain when we're asleep and when we're dreaming?
Yeah, that's a big question. It's one of these funny questions. We still don't know what sleep is for. It's everywhere in the animal realm, animal sleep. So it's probably related to the brain, but it may be as simple as getting rid of chemical substances that are produced during the day and that you have just to get rid of it, clean it up. Or it could have something more computational, like essentially rewiring or renormalizing synapses. And I think right now, it seems researchers are leaning towards the simpler and more trivial explanation of getting rid of chemicals that are not good and that accumulated during experience.
I don't know. To me, it seems that it's such an evolutionary disadvantage to be immobilized for a third of the day that you would prefer some kind of architecture that could do the continuous flushing. That sleep, therefore, it seems, must be something where the brain has to be unconscious to do whatever it's doing during that time. That the function of sleep must depend upon being unconscious. And that's as far as I've gotten. It kind of reminds me of backpropagation in some way, but we know that would be far too simplistic. But do you have any other theories?
Well, there are some other models of learning that require a sleep-awake cycle, so a separate time for storing memories from the time in which you are experiencing them. So that could be another type of explanation. There are even more trivial ones, like I think there are explanations saying, well, you want to save energy during a time in which, because it's dark, you cannot anyway get something to eat. And so not involved in the brain at all. I don't believe them, but they were certainly proposed multiple times.
It suggests that it might be one of those things where AI scientists have something to learn from the biological neuroscientists, because if every species that has some form of intelligence feels the need for this, then there must be some correlation between the function of sleep and the function of intelligence, and therefore they might want to discover what that is. Is there that or anything else that you think that the AI scientists really need to pay more attention to from neuroscience?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I don't know. I think, until 2017, I thought that the next breakthrough in AI would have come from neuroscience, because in a sense, the first two, one is reinforcement learning, another one is deep learning in the sense of multi-layer networks. They were both inspired by neuroscience. Reinforcement learning came from basically cognitive science, behavioral neuroscience, Pavlov being the first one. And deep learning came from research basically by Hubel and Wiesel in visual cortex, in which they proposed a system based on multiple layers of processing. And early models that actually were convolutional model much before Yann LeCun did the work by Fukushima in Japan that were really model of visual cortex. So the first breakthroughs came from neuroscience, including the idea of neural network as neurons connected to each other. And so I was a bit surprised when the transformers came out 2017 and afterwards and showed how powerful they are, because this was an idea that, despite the fact that there is attention in transformers is really an engineering idea that was not inspired by neuroscience. And since then, AI has really gone further into engineering-based developments. So I'm not sure, and you can argue they produced machines that pass a Turing test, so they've been quite successful. I don't know how much neuroscience could change that. I still think there is a lot we have to learn about intelligence in general, our intelligence in particular. But I don't know really, you ask me what breakthrough in neuroscience could be important for AI. Obviously, what I said about the equivalent of backpropagation could be important, could be an alternative which is, for instance, better from the, say, energy point of view. That's a general point. I think our brain consumes much less energy than our machines today.
It's another understatement.
Yeah, although, again, one has to be a bit cautious because one brain consumes less, but of course you want to provide access to ChatGPT to millions of people. So part of the energy consumption is effectively this fact that you are replicating this millions of times. But given this, there is the point that parallelism in our brain makes up for how slow our pseudo clock in the brain is. And slower clock means much less energy consumption because energy consumption goes up with the square of the frequency that you have. So understanding how the brain works, manages to achieve intelligence could certainly most likely lead to more energy efficient intelligent systems.
Has the colossal amount of interest and funding and research and development in AI produced any side effects in neuroscience through general funding or research or findings that you're able to apply in biological neuroscience?
I think there is quite a bit of interest in biological intelligence from the side of AI people, but till I think this is a situation where hedging investments in AI architecture by investing in biological intelligence should be done more, because of the enormous amount of capitals that are currently invested in, so to speak, the classical traditional AI. Traditional meaning as old as 5 years.
Right.
Right. But I think one effect that it's obvious in not only in neuroscience, but also in all other areas of research is this mix of enthusiasm and anxiety, quite a lot of anxiety in researchers. They are worried of being replaced by machines. And I think that's a real problem. In the past, new technologies have produced loss of jobs, but also new jobs. And the process has been slow enough that things worked out quite well at the end. But today is what is, I think, producing a lot of anxiety is how fast things are changing.
Mm.
So there is no, even just think what should I tell my grandchildren to learn? I have a couple of grandchildren here on the West Coast, and the oldest is 7 years old. Should I tell her to try to learn mathematics, or is programming over as something that you should learn? What about learning foreign languages?
I understand it's a very common conversation these days. Are you using frontier models in your research now? Are large language models or other kinds of generative AI useful to you in what you're doing?
Yes. The answer is definitely yes. I use Gemini and Claude and earlier ChatGPT kind of as a partner in doing research and writing papers. It's especially at the level of conversations, getting up to speed on a specific new approach, doing some of the mathematics about it. I find it as good as a graduate student, maybe first or second year. And I think that's a great situation. But what if 12 months from now, it's like speaking with my PhD advisor instead of a colleague or a younger graduate student?
You have students.
Yeah.
Are they postgraduate or a mix?
Both, a mix, yeah.
What is their general reaction to AI? They grew up in a world that didn't have ubiquitous generative AI. Now it is.
Yeah.
How do they feel about what it means for their future in school and after that?
I think there is anxiety coupled with enthusiasm. One of the reactions is also, let's do a startup. If I have to be replaced, I will be the one to replace myself. It also sometimes feels like, let's do a startup because soon it will be impossible to do it. It's a bit of a very interesting situation. I'm an optimist, so I think it's an exciting time. But certainly, especially for the young people, it's exciting but also difficult.
Switching to another kind of question. I heard you say that you're inspired by Einstein because of the sheer power of thought experiments. What sort of thought experiments do you do?
I'm certainly not of the type of Einstein, but it's more trying to find out whether there are foundational principles for intelligence like there are for physics. In physics, you can list a number of, for instance, conservation laws or symmetry properties from which a lot of physics can be derived. And is there something similar for intelligence? This is basically asking about mathematical properties. I mentioned earlier Turing computability. It turns out that a consequence of being able to represent a function with a program running on a computer, so efficient Turing computability implies sparse compositionality, so implies that a function that is efficiently Turing computable is actually representable accurately by a deep network. So you have this, essentially is a theorem in mathematics that neural networks are the right thing to represent everything that can be computed by a computer in a reasonable time. And this has also some implication about sparsity of the weights in transformers and things we know empirically to be correct. So something like this, sparse compositionality, could be one of the foundations of, let's call it, machine learning or intelligence.
How much evidence is there for or against the idea that the human brain is doing some kind of cognition outside of signaling across synapses? That there are other mechanisms within the brain using, say, glial cells or other things, neurotransmitters that contribute towards cognition without being part of the neural signaling process?
Yes, I think that it's almost certain glial cells are important for the brain. It's actually, a simplification could be that there is a lot which is going on, which is important for the brain, including glial cells that are more like a power supply in the computer, right? They are important, but not really doing the information processing. I think it's likely in biology these boundaries to be a bit fuzzy more than in the system we engineer. Because of the engineering, they're much more modular. It's more easier to separate the power supply from the rest. In biology, everything is a little bit more coupled together than in our modular system. So, in a sense, evolution was not always a good engineer, and that's part of the reason.
If we look at those components of architecture of human brain, and computational neuroscience is computers and neuroscience. So if we look at the architecture of computers, like a von Neumann architecture, we have very precisely defined layers that go from primitives all the way to a channel 2 nanometers wide on a chip. up through microcode to software libraries to Facebook. And we can trace everything from the top to the bottom or from the bottom to the top in those architectures. It wouldn't work if we couldn't do that. Do you think we'll ever be able to do something similar for human neural architecture that could take us all the way from synaptic triggering to consciousness? And I think, therefore I am.
Yes, I think we could. I think it will take longer time, of course, but I've been impressed recently by how much connectomics can tell us. So we have now, this was in the last few months, less than a year, a full connectome of the fruit flies, Drosophila. I did work on the fly in the Max Planck Institute in the earlier years of my career, so I like it as a system to be studied. It's interesting because on a logarithmic scale, on plotting number of neurons, the fly is essentially halfway between one cell organism and ourselves. It's about 1 million neurons against 10 to the 12 for our brain, roughly speaking. So kind of halfway. This involves the connectome is a essentially complete circuit diagram mapping all the 100,000, 150,000 neurons and all the connections between them, 150 million or so. And it turns out that by using the connectome and then of Drosophila and then some knowledge about which kind of synapses from other sources, one can simulate some of the behavior of the fly. So from the circuit diagram, you can actually reproduce some of the intelligent behavior of the fly. So it is a gargantuan work to imagine that we could do the same for our brain. Just to be explicit, if you are lucky, we'll see a connectome of a mouse brain in about 10 years from now.
Well, I remember hearing a few years ago about an open worm project to map the connectome of the nematode worm, which is, I think, 302 neurons, somewhat simpler. Did that ever produce a complete theory of worm?
Yeah, I think it did, but I don't know exactly. There are some problems with the nematode because neurons are very difficult to record from. So people know, not too much about what exactly they do and the transmitter but I think people have reproduced some of the behavior. But Drosophila is a more interesting case. The behavior is more intelligent. Flies can do amazing things like chase each other and land on the ceiling and so on. And there is a very concrete possibility to essentially reverse engineering what that brain does from the connectome. And of course, a lot of other data that people have collected over the years. So that's one case. As I said, it's a 6 order of magnitude smaller brain. So our brain is 1 million flies.
Well, I never thought of looking at it that way. One last difficult question. Imagine you walk into a room and they're seated around the table are Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Dario Amodei, Satya Nadella, and other luminaries like Sam Altman of today's AI companies. And they say, we want to make sure that we're not ignoring some kind of competitive advantage that could be gained in the future by taking on board important concepts about neuroscience. We want to give you 5 minutes to tell us anything we should be doing in that respect, and we will pay serious attention to it. What do you use that time for?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure how much I trust these guys to do the right thing, but...
Well, it's a thought experiment. It can only go so far. But as long as we're being hypothetical, imagine that they will pay attention to you.
Well, from a purely scientific point of view, right now I'd be very interested in this equivalent mechanism, equivalent to backpropagation that we're speaking about, whether we can find it in organisms like the mouse and the monkey. That is a very technical question. I think is an important one that can probably be answered soon. There are additional questions that I'm very curious about, like consciousness. And there I would like to do an experiment, which is to have a system like ChatGPT trained from scratch, but in a framework in which ChatGPT has a body. It could be a robotics body, simulated robotics body. And this body can be injured. So the system has to protect the body. And I wonder whether if you do this, so there is survival pressure through whether you will get a form of consciousness. I exist, so I am, which is quite different from what present large language models do.
A deep thought to end on. I want to make sure everyone knows you have a book coming out this summer, Brains, Minds, Machines, The Mystery of Human Intelligence, The Enigmas of the Artificial. And that is set for release in August. What do you want to tell us about that to whet our appetites and make people leap to the pre-order page, which we will link to?
Yes, that book is a translation from an Italian version. So it will be a little bit outdated, but I think the interesting part there is the biographical part, which is my trajectory towards AI. I think would be interesting in terms of looking at how we came to where we are now in terms of machine learning and AI, how we came through the path that took essentially the last 50 years or so.
Just for our Italian-speaking listeners, I'm looking also at the Italian title for that book, and could you say that just so that they can hear that one, because it's already out?
Yes, it's called Cervelli, Menti e Algoritmi, because machines, in Italian, translation is macchine, but in Italian really means cars. So, brains, minds, and machines. Yeah.
Thank you. Is there anything else you'd like our listeners to pay attention to follow, to read, or listen or watch?
Not really. I think they should watch out about the progress of AI. It's an exciting time. And I think to have more intelligence, which we are having and going to have more, should be great for everybody. We should also be cautious about it. But if you are cautious, if as a society we work to make more intelligence work for us, that would be a great future.
Well, thank you for your optimism. Thank you for the contributions you have made to this future that we are coming into so rapidly. And thank you, Tomaso Poggio, for coming on AI and You.
Thank you for having me.
That's the end of the interview. Isn't it amazing that we're finding out more every day about something so complex as the human brain, and we can use that in how we design AI? What a time to be alive. In today's news ripped from the headlines about AI, a preprint paper from researchers in China and Australia says that AI has changed learning so profoundly that doing well on a task no longer proves you learned anything. And this is at the heart of the problem with students using AI to do their homework. They propose something they call agentivism, a learning theory for a world where students and workers can hand parts of thinking over to AI. Whereas using AI can be like using a GPS, you get to the destination faster, but you likely didn't learn the route, agentivism embodies 4 steps. Delegate AI work selectively, not the whole task. Check and verify whether its answer is true and appropriate. Rebuild the AI's output in your own head so that you own it, and see if you can do that when help from AI is reduced. This reinforces something I've been saying for a long time, that schools should stop asking only, did the learner produce a good final product? They need to ask how AI was used and how the student learned. Treat AI less like a vending machine and more like a workout partner. Next week, my guest will be Katja Grace, co-founder of the AI Impacts Project. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.